In this episode, we look at how our patterns are turned into brass castings. So back in episode 3, we saw the patterns finished and sent off to have a mould made. We have now gone from this to this. But how did we get here? Well, let's go and see how the lost wax castings are made. Christian does all our casting work for us, so a visit to his workshop will show how our patterns become castings. The first stage is the wax process. So once the moulds have been made, they are dusted with talc powder, then wax is injected into the mould. After a few minutes this is cured, and the mould is opened to remove the wax pattern. Any imperfections in the wax must be corrected and repaired, as the casting process will duplicate the wax, including any defects.
Sinkage there, fixable, but sometimes it'll be scrapped.
Once all the required waxes are made, these are then built up onto a tree using a low temperature soldering iron. You'll note that not all of those waxes that are shown in this video are for our parts. After all the wax trees are filled up and completed, they're placed inside of a steel flask. These flasks are perforated and will be cast under vacuum, so that the liquid metal can fill all of the internal cavities. The plastic wrap is added and secured to the flask to seal and stop any leakage in the next stage. With the flask now ready, it's time for the plaster mixing. The plaster mix is then made up, mixed by hand for 2 minutes and the electric mixer for 2 minutes. This is then degassed for 2 minutes to remove any air bubbles which would stick to the castings and ruin them. Once the plaster mix is poured into the flasks, this is then degassed again. The plaster takes 15 minutes to set and the flasks are left for 3 hours before they are placed in the kiln for the burnout cycle. During the burnout cycle, the flask plaster becomes fully dried out and a percentage of wax will melt and drip into a collection tray under the kiln. Any remaining wax inside the flask will vaporise away once the flask reaches the end of the burnout cycle. This is where the lost wax term comes from. After 11 hours, the flasks are ready for casting. The desired amount of metal is added to a crucible. 50% scrap can be used with 50% fresh virgin metal cut from an ingot. After 11 hours, the burnout cycle is complete and the flasks are ready for casting. The kiln is dropping back to its desired casting temperature of 525 degrees. At this point, the crucible is placed in the furnace, which is now lit. It will take approximately 1 hour to be ready to pour the first flask.
So when I scrape that, you move back.
The slag and dross, which is impurities that come to the surface, is removed from the top of the crucible before the mould pour.
Move all the way.
Once the metal is at the desired temperature, the vacuum pump is used to create a vacuum in chamber 1. The first flask is then removed from the kiln and placed into the casting chamber. Fire clay is used around the top of the flask to protect the gasket and provide an airtight seal. When the flask and metal is ready, it's time to pour. The crucible is removed from the furnace and placed into a pouring tong. Just before pouring, the prepared built-up vacuum is released into the casting chamber. The metal is then carefully poured into the flask in one unbroken stream. Once the metal has solidified, then the flask can safely be removed. After 15 minutes, the flask is ready for quenching and the tree removed for cutting up and cleaning. The castings are cut from the tree using a hacksaw and placed into a citric acid solution overnight to loosen and dissolve any remaining plaster residue. The next day the castings are fully cleaned and left to dry before being packed ready for dispatch. Which very neatly brings us to where we have our sets of castings ready for the next stage. So that concludes this episode, so don't forget to subscribe and follow this project.